Okay, two very interesting presentations covering different aspects of working in these countries, but raising, very similar issues. I'm going to ask Vicki now, as our discussant, to make some comments and observations. And then after that, we'll open the floor to discussion for both the audience here as well as those online. Vicki?
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks both to Nikki and Bruce for really interesting presentations. And as you mentioned, Jonathan's article, Nikki, yours as well, I thought they were really raised some very, very pertinent points regarding this debate about humanitarian space and adherence to humanitarian principles more broadly. So for those who haven't read either of those, I strongly encourage you to do so. So I'm going to try to reflect on some of the key points that both made, although there are many, many interesting points that you highlighted. But just briefly, perhaps one of the overarching points I think both of you have drawn out in your presentations is more widely about this general or this trend for a politicization and militarization of humanitarian assistance in many contexts. And that this strategy or this trend is a major challenge to principled humanitarian action in many different contexts. It's not just related to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I'll come back to that towards the end of my comments. As Jonathan noted in his article, and Bruce raised it as well, military and security interventions, for example in Kosovo, in the past were justified for humanitarian reasons, and I'm not going to question that necessarily at this point. But post 9/11 in particular, the reverse is increasingly true. The aid is being used, humanitarian aid as well as development aid, is being justified for political, military and security objectives. Aid, as the ICRC noted more recently, I think just in the last week, aid in some of these contexts is being used as a conflict management tool. And Bruce, you mentioned some of the more blatant examples of that in the case of Afghanistan. And although perhaps we wouldn't necessarily expect an intervention of the scale of Afghanistan to be repeated in the near future, I think the trend for that still is here and will continue. This trend for politicization and militarization of aid, I think you've elaborated very well, but just to say, risks undermining the entire humanitarian enterprise, since it changes the focus from targeting humanitarian assistance towards those who need it most to where it's most advantageous for political, military or security reasons. And this obviously is not just a conceptual issue, it's not just a problem of principle or concept. There are clear operational risks inherent in this approach, I think, Bruce, as well as you've highlighted in your presentation. The first and primary risk, of course, is that the people who need aid, who need humanitarian assistance, may not get it because they're not in an area which is politically or security of interest to those who can facilitate that assistance. And secondly, and again, obviously there's much debate around this, is that any association with that type of strategy would risk undermining the credibility of international humanitarian actors in particular, as well as some of their national partners as well, those who seek to deliver assistance. They may be restricted in their access by belligerents to the conflict for various reasons, including because they're associated with a wider political strategy. It may also be the case that some communities themselves don't want to accept the presence of these agencies or accept their assistance. And obviously in extreme cases, there would seem to be some evidence to suggest that agencies have actually been attacked because they were associated with this wider political strategy. Just to reflect broadly on some of the key points that Nikki brought up about the militarization of response or civil-military coordination, how that might try to mitigate militarization of response. And obviously the militarization is linked more broadly to this wider political strategy. I think in the past there's been a tendency to think about civil-military coordination, the role of the military in humanitarian response as quite isolated. But obviously as increasingly member states, donor countries have multi-objective strategies combining political, military, security and aid objectives into that strategy. Military is not a standalone, it's part of that wider political objective. And obviously in Pakistan there was, and there has been in many other cases in recent years, a push for agencies to use military assets. This is not new, as Nikki said, it's not new in Pakistan either. Obviously, there was a very significant reliance on military assets in the response to the earthquake in 2005, for example, and in many of the crises that have occurred in that area since. In Haiti also, obviously, early last year, we saw quite a huge amount of military assets being deployed to respond to the needs emanating from the earthquake there in January. And despite, as Nikki mentioned, a plethora of guidance on civil-military coordination and when exactly military assets can be used to support humanitarian operations, adherence to these guidelines, to this guidance in Pakistan and many other contexts has been weak. And I sort of perhaps towards the end of the presentation would be interested to hear a bit more from Nikki about why that might be the case. And maybe sort of to broaden this debate out a bit from Afghanistan and Pakistan, to reflect perhaps some of the same issues that are coming up in the situation in Libya at the moment. We've done some preliminary sort of thoughts and discussions on the situation there, including with a number of agencies, I'm sure, who are represented here today. And there are perhaps a couple of key concerns that we see in Pakistan and Afghanistan that are resonating in Libya today as well. And one is about the politicization of the response and an increasing concern that the Security Council resolution mandates 1970 and 1973 and their focus on protection of civilians, that is being gradually expanded by some of the member states in what may be seen as a politicization of that sort of traditionally or stated humanitarian objective. Statements from various government officials, including from our own government, regarding regime change, the removal of Gaddafi, and also the provision of military and tactical support to rebels may indeed be undermining this concept that in theory the NATO operation is for a humanitarian purpose. In addition, also, in discussions that we've had with a number of operational agencies, many have expressed a concern that they felt under pressure by some member states involved in the coalition to accept the use of military assets in the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Libya. And whilst, as far as I'm aware, that has been resisted to date, obviously there's concern that pressure may build in that regard. However, the threats to, or the challenges related to politicization and militarization of the humanitarian response in many contexts don't only come from those outside our sector. It's not only member states that are presenting these challenges. As the ICRC most recently, but also MSF, including in Afghanistan, I believe, have pointed out, our own behavior as humanitarian actors in many of these crises, in terms of respecting humanitarian principles and responding to these external challenges, has been very remiss, to say the least. Whether it's about the use of military assets or expanding the boundaries of humanitarian activities, as you mentioned, Brice, there's a need for some quite clear self-reflection within our community about how we behave and how we ourselves adhere to humanitarian principles. In that respect, I guess the experience that Nikki articulated in Pakistan demonstrates the difficulties, in particular, reaching consensus around, for example, the use of military assets and how to have, or what degree of dialogue to have with military actors, including, for example, as she articulated, in determining what might constitute a last resort for using military assets. In that context, Nikki, I was quite heartened to hear from your survey that many of the humanitarian actors present in that context felt that dialogue and constructive dialogue with the Pakistani military was a key priority for them. But obviously that's not always the case, and it'd be interesting to explore that a bit further. Obviously, also within our own sector, there's concern that you mentioned, Reese, about agencies using two hats at the same time, and that really does fundamentally challenge the concept of humanitarian action or some of the key principles of humanitarian action. And maybe just a couple of final points. As you mentioned, Bruce, and I think this is really important, it came out in some other events that we've had on humanitarian space and that concept and what it means. The idea that humanitarian space has to be earned. It's not a right that humanitarian actors can take. And also, I think perhaps you mentioned something in your experience of MSF in Afghanistan. Research conducted more recently, or commissioned more recently by OCHA on operating in high-risk environments, effectively concluded that adhering to humanitarian principles, in particular impartiality, really does matter, and that it's fundamental to ensuring that people who need assistance can actually access it. Maybe just one or 2 points on moving forward, how to try to move this debate in a more concrete operational direction. I put my former OCHA hat on to say that I think, as Nikki has demonstrated, there's clearly a need for concerted interagency dialogue on these challenges to humanitarian space, in particular to reduce this polarization between, as Wendy mentioned, sort of very strict adherence to humanitarian principles, the do-nontist gang on one side, and then the multi-mandate orientated NGOs perhaps on the other, UN as well in that regard. I think that's obviously essential in terms of trying to understand amongst our community what are the boundaries of humanitarian action, how can we adhere to principles ourselves, but also how can we come together to more effectively face and mitigate the challenges presented to our work and to the humanitarian enterprise by external actors. And again, I would sort of very much urge and echo the thoughts of the ICRC, who published an article, I think it was just this week, about this problem of politicization of aid, the need for very critical self-reflection of our own behavior in this regard. But I